Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. Maybe you don't know the name, but maybe you recognize the hair or the voice behind our YouTube channel, Three Blind Men and an Elephant. But I'm also a writer, photographer, filmmaker, and an utterly biased Leicaphile. Now, we're here to talk about journeys, especially the journey that many of us take to Leica, the road to Leica. In fact, my photographic journey began more than half a century ago with this camera. There we go. In which was taken a Kodachrome slide that I first saw when I was 6 or 7 years old, secondhand bought from Hilda Hubbock, a Bauhaus trained photographer who left Germany in 1933 or 1934. So you can just imagine how stoked I was when Leica invited me to guest host this very special edition of Stay Home with Leica. It's really my privilege and pleasure to introduce to you the man who is responsible for where Leica is today, the man responsible for the vision of Leica for the future, and maybe most critically, I think so, the steward of the Leica heritage. I'm talking about the chairman of the Supervisory Board for Leica Camera, Dr. Andreas Kaufmann. Andreas, long time no see.
Hi, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello from Frankfurt. I'm in a traveling mode because the lockdown here in Germany, in Austria, where I live, is already down, and we have tomorrow our supervisory board meeting. So, hello.
So really, thank you very much, because it's 10 p.m. your time. We're going to keep you up for another hour when you've got a lot to do tomorrow. I think since this episode is entitled The Road to Leica, and every single one of us has a unique origin story, a unique journey, I thought I'd begin with a short quote from Marcel Proust. Now, for those of you who don't know, Proust was the writer who most influenced, inarguably, the founder of modern street photography as we know it, Henri Cartier-Bresson. So Proust wrote, "We don't receive wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves after a journey that no one can take for us or spare us." I think that's called scar tissue. So, Andreas, there are so many ways to talk about journeys, so many kinds of journeys, but let's start this way. How the heck did you get to Leica?
Usually that would be a 3-volume novel, but I keep it short. So, our family comes originally from a totally different background, which was pulp, paper, and packaging in a company which was founded in 1903 near Vienna. So totally different background. We sold the last remaining shares in this 2004, and that was the year when we, three brothers Kaufmann, entered via our entity ACM into Leica Camera. Funny thing, at this time, the main shareholder was Hermes. So Hermes, you know, the icon. And for us, entering into this industry, it was a sort of, you know, a bit like a knighthood or so. But then suddenly we realized, it's not a complete knighthood, it looks more like a restructuring. And then the real journey started in 2005, and it was sometimes a little bit of what you might call a helter-skelter or something like this. Since then, it's my family now, the Andreas Kaufmann part of the family. We consider ourselves in charge as a majority shareholder, because in 2011, we sold 45% to the American company, not completely unknown, called Blackstone. But we are the majority shareholder and see ourselves to drive this company into a completely different setup and future, but always keeping in mind, bearing in mind the huge heritage we have based on especially the history of the Leitz family. So that's in a short, to keep the 3-volume novel short. That's how we came to Leica 2004 and since then.
Well, so right, you were the interim CEO 2007, 2008. You've really been deeply involved with the company, and you've had time to really get into that history. So that's a journey in and of itself. Can we talk about that a little bit? The journey of Leica from its beginnings through where we are today?
Well, just a short thing in brackets. As um, I was in the software industry and still are since 1997. So I had a bit of a background, especially for this change which happened in the whole camera industry, coming from analog into digital. So, but the whole Leica story is basically more than 120 years, the story of the Leitz family. And unfortunately, Knut Kuhn Leitz just died a month ago or so. He was the last of the Leitz family who was a manager in this company, and we owe them a huge lot. It's the humanistic approach. It's this huge exploration into optics. It's the design code and a lot of other things. So the story of Leica started as Leitz, 1869. The Leitz family went out finally in the 80s of the last century, and from 1990 on, the whole Leitz group was renamed Leica, which marketing-wise was probably not that great because the whole group was renamed after a product. So, but we have to live with this.
It's really an amazing story. I love the journey that Leica shifted to. It's like it took a different path from microscopes, high quality precision optics. And then there's this young guy, as so often happens in the last 150 years of history. It's never just photography, it's also cinema, it's movies. And this young guy who really can't lift the field cameras, it's really too big. He wants to go hike in the mountains. He can't do it. And as a film buff, he actually designs a tool which allows him to determine what the light sensitivity is of cinefilm. That's how it starts. And then he turns it sideways, and all of a sudden we have the basis for the first Leica.
Well, Oscar Barnack, the guy you were talking about, he even built his own cine camera in 1913 or 1912. We still have this camera. It was inspected 2 years ago by a friend of mine, John Fowler, who is the editor of Film and Digital Times. And he said, wow,
right,
not a bad cinema camera. So this was the background, using something which was standardized at this time, because the only film which was standardized was the cinema film. And then he decided to do it the other way. So we have the 24 by 36 millimeter format, which nowadays is called full frame.
It is amazing to think that a guy flipped it sideways and just decided that a 3:2 aspect ratio suited him, and it has stood the test of time. But that's true for so many of Leica's cameras, none more so, obviously, than the Leica M. So let's talk a little bit about that, shall we?
Oh yes,
Take us
because
through
I'm
that.
always traveling with an M at the moment, with the M10P ASC, which I think is a great tool.
Well, I kind of agree with you. My autofocus is
Okay.
better than yours. Okay. All
Okay.
right.
Now we're
So
talking.
let's go. But let's go back to what makes the M so extraordinary and what I think makes Leica so extraordinary. You mentioned two things in particular. You mentioned the humanistic approach, and you mentioned design. So I know you are really into design. I know you're into modern art. We talked about this the other day a little bit. The thing that was interesting is that this series of cameras had actually two separate windows, one to compose and one to frame. That was an option,
Yeah.
because it was so difficult. And then the real innovation of the M series was that the rangefinder was integrated into the window. But it is the design that is so extraordinary. Can you talk to us a little bit about the history of Leica design and all the way up to the present?
Well, the design of Leica was driven at a certain time by a member of the Leitz family, Ludwig Leitz. He was a sculptor, but he was also an inventor, so he never could decide which way to go. And he designed, basically, the camera was called the Leica 4. It was part of the museum. It was the forerunner of the Leica M, but then something happens on the way to a forum, as the British say. the Second World War came, which stopped every development. And then after the World War, there was still the time of turmoil. So 53, the M came. The design by Ludwig Leitz and another guy, which he got from the art school of Hanover, was always, he used this kind of what Le Corbusier called modular, which means taking certain measures from the human being, from the dimensions of humans, and trying to transfer this into technology, which means until nowadays, this funny design, you could say, on a certain way, because when you look at the M, the lens is not in the middle. Yeah, but it's balanced and buffered in the way how it is done. So this design was driven by certain dimension taken from human dimensions, which was the typical approach by Ludwig Leitz and his companion. So we live with this, and thank God we have this, because in the 70s it nearly was killed. There's always the problem when you do something and then the technology changes, which happened finally end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s with the SLRs. So it was considered to be obsolete. Thank God it was saved by the Midland company, which was called Elcan, Ernst Leitz Canada, because they said, okay, send me the tools, we produce them. So they saved the M, and nowadays, you know, the M, I think, is the perfect tool for shooting, because you can do everything how you want to do in the picture. You can shoot in an automatic mode, but then you can switch off everything and then say, okay, I need a wide open aperture. Okay, here I have the setting, and so on and so forth. So the M is probably a pretty good tool nowadays to learn photography, to elevate your own art of photography. That's my point of seeing it.
It's such an interesting thing. I did not know about modular, but what I did recognize, and I just want to share this with everyone, insofar as the dimensions of the 3A, the radius is basically perfect for a 35 millimeter roll of film. And that didn't change. In fact, I regard the Leica CL as one of the most, actually no, I regard it as the most successful homage to a past camera of all. Well, and it's got the same basic radius.
If you would talk to our Peter Karbe, our optical magician, yeah, he would say if Oscar Barnack would live today, he would do the CL as an APS-C camera. That's his way of of saying this.
Fantastic, fantastic. But you also make the point, and I think this really is a great segue into, I think, one of the biggest questions that you must be facing, which is the M has an incredible history. The M was the camera of choice and remains for purists the camera of choice for street photography, photojournalism, combat photography. I mean, it's absolutely legendary. So whether it was Cartier-Bresson or...
I brought a picture of one of our great Magnum photographers, the Swiss guy. So he always
Robert
around with the M camera. But here's another one. So that's more probably a bit more of a street kid. Yeah, yeah, with the M.
All right.
So that's.
I got one too.
Oh yeah, that's
I got one too.
Right, Elliot.
Yes, that's Elliot, and he signed it. So we got that from Magnum. It's small, but we like it. But the question about the M today is, in an era of computational imaging, megapixel mania, you know, hundreds of autofocus points. This is a camera that has been honed, but is essentially the same shooting experience as more than half a century ago. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, at the moment, in the Leica M, we're talking 24 megapixel, and that's a huge amount of megapixel. Will it stay that way? Okay, let's see. But on the other hand, this is a very small body. To get in all this kind of technology, in the M10, we had to decide, for instance, to leave video out. First, a true M photographer says video, that's for a different tool. And we would say, okay, you're right, because that's the SL or the CL. And we had to decide to keep it as small and handy as the M10 now is, to keep it out, because otherwise the amount of heat which are produced by 24 megapixels going through the processor would have been tricky in this camera. Will we have in future maybe a bit even more? Well, let's see what can be done, because it always boils down to this: what kind of technology can we get into this small body? But I think we have very clever engineers for that.
Yes, it's easy to agree with that. The M10 represented a return to the original form. It's actually thinner front to back, for those of you who don't know. And while many of you would see this as just a difference without a distinction, for Leica files, a distance of 1 millimeter or 2 can make a big deal. And in fact, of course, you now have the M10 monochrome, which is already 40 megapixels. So I'm confident that you guys will rise to the challenge. On the other hand, I understand exactly what you're saying. This is my latest obsession. I just got the Summicron 35.
That's a race machine.
It's a race machine. Well, Peter Carbe just, he cost me, because I interviewed him in Wetzlar, late last year. And I asked him, what is his favorite lens? And he says, oh, no, I can't say, I get into trouble when I do that. And I said, oh, I understand. Well, if you were on a desert island and I couldn't even finish the sentence, 35 millimeter Summicron, that's it.
Yeah, but
when
Bresson would have said, no, it should have been the 50. He always did stick
Yeah, I wonder about that. And the Apo Summicron 50, that new 50, is extraordinary. And you continue to innovate with the Apo Summicron. And most recently, I had a chance to get my hands on the 90 millimeter Summilux 1.5, which is incredible.
It should have been called Noctilux, because it's basically a Noctilux. But we decided, as is at 1.5, okay, the Summilux. But it's pretty tricky to do a 1.590 with this amount of glass, etc.
Yeah. So the Leica M, I find, because we're in lockdown still where we are, I've had the M10P, and I had the M8 years ago. I ended up selling it. I should never have sold the glass. I should never have sold the glass. Yeah. But it's okay. You live and you learn. That's part of my journey. But what I've learned how to do is use the camera the way it was intended. It's really interesting. Most lenses these days, like the TL and SL lens lines of Leica, have no aperture rings, no depth of field scales. But the M lenses, of course, do. And that's really the way to shoot so often, with zone focus. And the rangefinder actually works. And the thing that just hit me, Andreas, a couple of days ago, is that when you do zone focus, you can only do that with a rangefinder, where the view is not linked to the focus point. If you have an EVF, integrated EVF, or you have an SLR, what you see is what you get. So you actually can't, even if you've got an aperture ring and a depth of field scale on a manual lens, it's a more difficult thing to do. And you talk about essentials when you talk about the M in particular. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, in Germany, we use the claim, and we have this claim worldwide, das Wesentliche, which is even more than essential. So I was just shooting downstairs, so I had aperture 4, which means in aperture 4, due to the focus elements here, I had a range of roughly 3 or 4 meters, where in there's a sharpness. So that's always a great thing if you understand this, what you can do with an M lens. And the other thing is, if you have an autofocus, you need a motor element, and that makes it bulky. You have to
What a great
compensate
point.
this. You have to compensate this that you might probably not take metal, but plastic. Nothing against plastic, it can work, but to redo this after 10 years gets more tricky than when you have this done in metal. So in metal, without motor elements, this is very sustainable because you can reproduce this, you can do this servicing every 5 years, every 10 years, it doesn't matter. A motor for autofocus, even if you do choose the highest technology, will it last 15 years? We don't know actually. So the M is always the purest form of shooting, and it will stay that way. Although inside the camera, you know, with the Maestro 2 we have, it's you know the secret that there's somewhere a Maestro 3 in the line, etc., etc. So inside high-end technology, but the whole setup pretty, I would say, easy to service and keeps it smaller and easier to handle if you know how to handle. Yeah. So I always said the tagline for the M system should be, "I know how to focus in my life."
Well, it's pretty interesting. You make a really wonderful point. I mean, here is the SL2 with the 35 Summicron. Let me see if I can go like that. And then this is the M10 with the 50 to give you a sense of just how, you know, for those of us who don't know, I mean, the difference is extraordinary. You have to stop doing that to me.
Yeah. So and if I go back here, it just feels differently, and you can carry it around like this and shoot like this. So coming back in photography, in my opinion, as a photographer, you always sort of come back to the end.
I think that's right. It's an heirloom kind of thing. I mean, we talk about Leicas lasting a lifetime. Well, I managed to take this one apart. You know the story about this. I was maybe 10 years old and the vulcanite was peeling a little bit. So I just peeled it all off and then I spray painted the body black. I thought that would be good. And then I spray painted the top.
You have a different setup usually in how you think design should be done.
Yeah. I think putting the chalk in, that really was the straw that broke the camel's back. But what's always struck me is that the greats of the last century, mid-century, they understood not menu settings, they understood 8 feet. And it reminds me of Alfred Eisenstadt, who, of course, was one of the greatest photographers of all time. And I have a personal connection with that because he used literally the 3A that I have right now with a Visoflex. And of course, that image in the center, VJ Day, is the one that he is most known for. The thing that was interesting is he set his 3A to 100th of a second, and it was f8, and he set it to, I think it was 10 feet. And he, the story goes, saw this sailor kissing every single woman he could find on VJ Day, the end of World War II. And IZ kept running in front of him, constantly looking back, and he caught this shot. The irony is that if you really understand and interact with the real world, if you really understand distance, then the M can be faster than an autofocusing camera. That kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I think it was in one of our galleries, they found 3 or 4 other photographers who who shot more or less the same scene, but it did not work. Yeah, so it looks boring or plain or whatever. So IZ with this eye caught this, and it's right. Yeah, you can't change.
Exactly so. Exactly so. But while we have this up, I want to make another point and explore this with you. We talked very briefly about that minor interruption called World War II. I have a view that the most significant photographs, you can't divorce politics from the technology. So here are 3 images that Eisenstadt did. One, that's Goebbels in the 1930s. You've got VJ Day in 1945, and 4 months later, on the right, you have a scene that Eisenstadt captured in Hiroshima. And I don't know how you think about this, Andreas. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, but every single time I pick up a Leica, I feel the weight of history coursing through that body into mine. And it makes me feel like I need to do good work and I need to make it count.
I think that's pretty much true. That if you grab up a Leica, it's connecting with history. You know, one of the pictures which really did influence me when I was a young guy. Yeah, this one, The Napalm Girl by Nick Ut. Yeah.
Oh yes.
This is the original picture. It was not cut. So on the side, you see a photographer who is trying to change a film on his Leica. Dave Burnett, he's known. Yeah, Nick. But this picture, it was cut here, like this, and then shown via AP. Was one of those pictures which still sticks into my mind, although I was a young guy then studying. And when you have a Leica in your hand, and with the M, it really comes this feeling you are connecting with the history of photography. And that can be a burden, but on the other hand, it's not a burden. It's a sort of, you try to capture a moment according to how you would like to capture the moment. And I would say 90% it does not work. So Cartier-Bresson once said, you know, the first 10,000 pictures are bad anyway. And nowadays in digital, you probably have the factor 20 or so. But it gives you this kind of, I want to use this. I want to be part of it, although I'm a bloody amateur. Yeah. So I think you're right in that.
Well, it's interesting, back to this notion of origin stories and different roads that people take to come to Leica. I'm thinking of Elliot Erwitt, but don't let me forget. You have to remind me. I have to ask you the first time you heard about Leica. We know this story, but I'm thinking about other photographers who have come to Leica and their paths, and I'm struck by the diversity of it. Elliot Erwitt, of course, is one of my favorite photographers, and I had the privilege to actually sit down with him and interview him. I think it was in 2018 at the ICP when it was down on the Bowery. And he was a 22-year-old kid who was approached by Roy Stryker of the Farm Security Administration to take photographs of Pittsburgh as it was being redeveloped. And I asked him, what was he thinking? And he said to me in his very Elliot way, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just going out and shooting. And yet he accomplished so much. He started off with a 4x5 plate camera, but eventually, of course, the game was Leica because it was so small, compact, and unobtrusive. And yet he was not always serious. So on the one hand, he's a photojournalist who captured that incredible moment between Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon. And on the other hand, in 2000, there's the picture of the dog on the lady's lap. Just fantastic. So I'm not going to wait. I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind sharing with the rest of us, how you first came, not to the company, but to the camera, because there's a story there.
In my family, there always were cameras, but not good ones. So I had for a certain time a Rollei cord, which was sort of okay. It was the cheap Rollei, but we never had Leicas because we were brought up rather frugal. And the story, I told this a few times, had to do with when I was around studying. My fiancée at this time, she was doing the photographer's apprenticeship, which is not so much known nowadays anymore, because in Germany you did the 3 years apprenticeship at a photographer, but the photographer was also selling film, was selling cameras, introduction into the darkroom, etc. And once she came, she originally bought from the small money she got a Miranda, a Japanese SLR. But once she came, and showed me a camera like this and said, look what I've got. And I was never so much interested in cameras, so I said, it's a camera. And then she said, no, look what I've got. I said, a camera? And then she sort of tried to focus me with her eyes. She had very beautiful eyes and said, no, look better. What do I have here? I said, at the next site, it's still a camera. And then she said to me, it's a Leica. And the sound of this, how she pronounced Leica, was sort of, ooh, what's the matter with her? Yeah. So for her, it was probably an SL2. Because she was always in SLRs. Yeah. So for her, a Leica was sort of, the sound of the Holy Grail or something like this. So, and I said, after she said the Leica, I said, well, it is just a camera. So, and that was the wrong, the wrong message from my side. But since then, I mentioned this, it's sort of this sound, yeah, it's a Leica, yeah, got stuck somewhere. But it did take quite a few years. As I mentioned, 2004, I bought my first Leica in February 2004 in Vienna. The camera has now my son, it is an MP.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think going back to the M, there are certain things about it. Confucius said that life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. And E.F. Schumacher, the guy who came up with the geodesic dome. I love this. He said, any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. So it's funny, you came to Leica because of a woman, which probably a good number of us do, if we're honest with ourselves. And yet it stayed stuck there. And now you are in charge of its present and its future. Have you spent much time with the monochrome, the M10 monochrome?
Yes, the 40 megapixel monochrome is pretty tricky because it has such a huge dynamic range that you have to think a little bit different when you had the other monochromes before. So I'm still learning. I'm using it at the moment with an old non-aspherical 1.435, and I would say 80% of the pictures I don't like, but it gets better. So
well, you made the point earlier about how many pictures you have to take. Cartier-Bresson, the first 10,000 are terrible.
yeah.
But I'm always struck by two metrics when we talk about Robert Frank, another Leica enthusiast and a professional photographer. I do want to, at some point, talk about the role of the amateur and the role of professional and the path for each to Leica. But when Robert Frank introduced or published The Americans in 1958, this was a guy who had been born in Switzerland. He emigrated to the United States. He thought the United States was going to be one thing as he traveled the country on a Guggenheim grant, where he eventually visited 40 of the then only 48 states.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be until the following year that Hawaii and Alaska joined.
Yeah.
He found that America wasn't what he thought it was. But he took, I think this is right, 28,000 images, 28,000, which were reduced to a book of about 85, which I think is just incredible. Incredible.
Well, my personal opinion is if you want to publish a book about the Americans, it needs much more pages than this. America is such a huge, the US is such a huge part of a continent with so different elements. I only know quite a few states, but in my opinion, Robert Frank should have published probably about 2 times or 3 times more to really show this huge diversity which exists, these huge different elements of the US. But on the other hand, this kind of style, he had a very individual style, because usually the pictures about the USA were different. Yeah. So this
Very.
sort of set the tone for quite a certain time. But nowadays, shooting the Americans would be, I would say, a book as big as this or so to show this. And nowadays, I would definitely use color.
Well, of course, when we speak about color and we think of Leica, Joel Meyerowitz absolutely is among those who embraced it.
That
Of
would
course, he
be,
also used much larger cameras as well.
uh,
I'm sorry?
Joel would be one because when you saw his work about Tuscany or his work about the Provence, yeah, one
Mm.
should commission him and say, Joel, this is the huge epitome of your work. Shoot the Americans part two. Well, Konstantin Manus could be also one because his book American Colors, I think that's how you should shoot when you do something nowadays, the Americans.
It's really interesting because again, under lockdown, I haven't been able to shoot in New York, which is where I really get my juice. New York City, it's where I was born and lived for many years. We're out here in the suburbs. And again, life has slowed down enough so that I've really learned the M in a way that I hadn't before. And the irony is, Andreas, that I'm definitely a black and white guy. And yet I find that the colors coming off the sensors inside the current Leicas are so beautiful that there are times when color trumps all. And I'm very surprised by that.
That's a
So
huge word by
it's
you.
really,
That's a huge word by a black and white shoot. Well, you know, the aim with Leica cameras is always internally we say the way how Asian cameras see colors is always a little bit different than you see it from a European point of view. So at Leica we try to create what we would call natural colors, yeah? And then also the color rendering, etc., done in a certain way. So this is somewhere between technology and art, because you know I once said I want to have the little red book called The Art of Leica Photography. So where everything technology-wise is written in what we do, and then the people said, we can't do that. It's too complicated, and it has sometimes to do with certain history, because this guy did this for 20 years, etc. He knows how to do this, etc., etc. So until now, we don't have the little red book about the Leica secrets, how to do color and black and white.
well, we'll talk about that someday. But I think that what really struck me, and I want to ask you, maybe it's just that I have enough time to look up at the sky more than I did. You're much busier, I think. But I have found, because of lockdown, and I think because of the drastically fewer number of vehicles on the road, the drastically curtailed number of flights, I said to my wife, Claudia, over a month ago, that the skies reminded me of the skies of my youth. And I posted a shot taken on the M10P 2 days ago on Instagram.
Mhm.
And I thought, Andreas, that the colors reminded me of nothing so much as a Kodachrome slide.
Well, Kodachrome was you know, that was a really great film, yeah, because you know, you had these three versions. You had the Fuji, you had the Kodachrome, and the Aqua, yeah. And the Kodachrome was somewhere, in my opinion, always in the middle, and right in the colors. The Fuji was always a little bit on the greenish, bluish side, and the Aqua color was a little bit more on the brownish side. So in our former opinions, Kodachrome, yeah, that if one could reproduce this always in a sensor, which is not that easy, that would be probably how you should shoot color. Absolutely.
You make a really good point. I think it's only because our air quality has changed that I can quite nail the colors, that it can so instinctively. Have you ever had this experience, Andreas, where you smell something and all of a sudden it just catapults you back to your childhood? That's what happened the other day. And it's interesting because, of course, Kodachrome, when I shot with it, was not even, well, then they used ASA, but it wasn't even ASA 64. It was ASA 25. And now I find I can shoot on the M10P 24 megapixel sensor up to 6400 with no problem. It just looks beautiful to me.
Even 12,500 might still work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is when you talk about how you use a camera, you know better than most that really the first Leica was designed for 50 millimeter, and the frame lines have changed over the years. There have been times where the magnification has been as low as 0.58. The original M3, again, suited ideally for a 50 millimeter, was set at 0.91. But if you went outside, even today with the M10 line of cameras, really the sweet spot for these cameras is from 28 to 90. And it used to be that for cameras like these, you would have lenses with goggles on them. So if you wanted to shoot 135, there'd be a whole additional optical set in front for right here. Yeah. But now you've got this. Right?
Yeah.
You've got the VisoFlex Type 20. So even though the camera doesn't have an integrated EVF, I find that if I want to shoot beyond those ranges, above 90 or below 28, like 24 is my favorite, there's now a means to do it.
Absolutely. Although I never liked it personally. I don't like.
Great salesman.
It's a secret. I don't like the design of it. It was a little bit sort of brutalish, Germanish, something like that. Yeah, I would have done it probably a little bit more Italian. But anyway, so but technology-wise, you're absolutely right. And nowadays, you could even use with an adapter an old 200, which did exist, etc., on the M with this, because it works. Yeah.
You know, I want to explore with you, for everyone who's watching, a little bit more about your design ethos. You are actually a member of the Salzburg Museum of Modern Art, is that right? And
Yes.
I asked you the other day if you think that music and photography go together. That was an interesting discussion. So can you talk a little bit about Bauhaus, about Deco, because it seems to me that especially Art Deco and Bauhaus found their way into Leica cameras. And at one point, I think design was done outside of the house, but now you've brought it back in. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it has to do, this is one part of the heritage, it has to do with the Leitz families, because Ernst Leitz II, for instance, the villa he built during the First World War in Wetzlar, Haus Friedwart, which means the villa who looks into peace, was designed by one of the leading, you call it style liberty, architects from Munich. And he sent his children to a school which was very much influenced by this modern direction, which was then part of the Bauhaus movement. So it went a certain modern way of how you do things, how you create things, was there installed in the company due to the Leitz family, because they were huge lovers of art. They were great lovers of music. They were connected with a lot of musicians, which were always invited to their villa. So this kind of element we owe the Leitz family. Bauhaus in itself means sometimes wrongly understood. It's a very brutal way of doing a concrete facade. But done right, is that you reduce things to the pure function, but that the function is the design, and you are not always able to create this. But I think this element, because we just had yesterday a discussion at our design department, which is based in Munich. Yeah, this element trying to reduce certain things, that the function the function is shown in the design, and that it looks good but reduced. That's, I think, the Bauhaus heritage which goes through there. Our design team, by the way, are originally members of the design team of Walter de Silva, who was a great and still is a great designer, especially cars. He came from Alfa Romeo to the Volkswagen Group, and with him we did in 2009 the M9 Titanium and also the M9 Hermes, which are still sort of design icons. So and Walter de Silva, his team was Italian influenced, but on the other hand, as is the Volkswagen Group, people always love to look into the reduction of the Bauhaus. And we have a few people from his design team, so I think we have a good setup here to keep this alive.
Thank you for that. You know, what I think I'd like to do now is I'd like to take some questions from the audience. So let me start. Yeah, it's time to get cracking. How has the innovation and evolution on the software side of photography affected Leica's R&D investments going forward? And this person was thinking about smartphones, despite Leica occupying a different niche entirely. So you and I talked about this the other day.
Leica does software since 1994 because that was the time when the digital department was set up. So, and maybe some people remember the S1 shown in 1996. The whole workflow was developed inside the house, which was tricky because there were no real memory cards then, etc., etc. So software has influenced. Software is a key part of the technology because you need to interpret a stupid sensor, because a sensor basically is stupid, into that it creates this, what we call Leica photography. And looking into the smartphone world, well, we had a little bit of a bad experience because we invested into a company which was called Light. And some people might remind that they showed the Light 16. It had to do with a case that we followed the so-called array systems since 2010. And we thought, oh, Light, and there was also an investment by SoftBank, Light, that's the solution for array. It wasn't. So, but we learned out of this, and we just have a setup for a huge project, which internally is called Walter, but this will be only told next year.
Well, so there's another way that you are using computational imaging. And so let me get to the next question, because it's really just about that. Now that firmware 2.0 brought multi-shot to the SL2, pardon me, there more room for new ways of utilizing software and firmware in current Leica cameras?
Basically said yes, but usually I would say we do not comment on ongoing projects.
I knew you were going to say that, but it's a great question. So let's continue.
No. Well, one thing is very clear. The use of a single shot sensor in different ways creates a future for better digital pictures. Full stop, and we're working on that.
Right. So algorithms, artificial intelligence, I get it. Leica, this next person asks, I want to ask this question. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected Leica, its personnel, and its production? I think that's a great question because Leica has quite an enlightened history when it comes to its people.
Well, we had to shut down production completely for between 5 and 6 weeks because part of the supply chain was broken, and it was not clear if in the factory in Wetzlar or in Portugal we would have a COVID case. Thank God we didn't. So we started production 3 weeks ago. The whole company was either in short labor or home office. In the US, we were basically able to keep our employees, which in the American system usually is not the case, because we're very clear. There was a certain moment around the 10th of March where we looked into the numbers that, oops, this does not look good, because it looked as if we lost 90% of the business because all the stores worldwide were closed. but it changed, and thanks to our also customers, we intend to this year probably come up with a black zero, which is quite a lot under this condition COVID-19 created. We have security measures taken in Wetzlar, Portugal. In the morning, we do this, temperature checking, etc., and we hope we're on a good track. But to give you an example, when the US was slowly, partially recovering, the stores were opening, then part of the stores were looted. So that was also not completely helpful. So we were...
I did not know you were a master of understatement.
Yeah, it was unhelpful.
Let me ask you a next question. We only have a few more minutes, but these are very good. We talked earlier about Oscar Barnack setting a 3:2 aspect ratio, and that was 95 years ago, actually more than 100 given when he first started. So this question is pretty interesting. Leica has been doing photography for over 100 years. How does today's Leica camera set the stage for the next 100 years?
At the moment, we're actually working on that. Yeah. So we just sat together and said, what's the 5 years plan? Because at the moment, 100 years is pretty tricky to plan, but 5 years to 10 years, you can try to do that. We think we have a few things where this will change the industry. You will hear something about this the months to come. We have a very special position in this industry because we're the only one who covers distribution and retail, which means a direct communication with a customer, with a friend, you could say. So, and there are a few other setups in technology, which we think this will help to shape the future. But at the moment, as I said, I don't comment on ongoing projects.
Well, thank you for giving us that much. Here's a really nice question aimed directly at who you are, Andreas. This person asks, what thrills you the most about what you get to do with Leica? What part of your job brings you the most joy? What a profoundly appropriate word. What motivates you?
It's a responsibility for more than 2,000 employees worldwide when you look into that. And on the other hand, there's a sort of, as we mentioned at the beginning, a sort of heritage. Yeah, you could call it a stewardship, perhaps. There are certain things which are there, which make sense, and it makes a lot of sense to develop this into the future and create also stable jobs with that. And on the other hand, do something where the customer says, oh, I want this. Because if we do this, if we do the right thing, something where the customer says, I want to have it, yeah, then I think we're on the right track, and that gives joy.
Yeah, well, I have that all I wanted thing all the time. I have to say that the 23 millimeter.
Yeah.
Okay, you go.
I bought the S3 with my own money, yeah, because I wanted to have it. Yeah, so I had to queue up, and I bought it, and I was one of the first customers because there was, fortunately, I didn't know when it came on the market, so I was there, and I think I'm a typical customer in a way. I wanted to have this tool because for landscape photography, or when you use the 120 millimeter macro, this creates color pictures. Which, when you look at this at the screen and try to print this out, it gives you this, that's joy.
Hey, I had that experience with the Type 007 a couple of years ago, doing street photography with a medium format DSLR in London, and I was just blown away by it, blown away. So, wow. Okay, let's see. Do we have time for, well, we may have time for one more. Hang on a second. Can you talk about the decision-making in creating the original Leica monochrome?
The decision-making was very simple because we found out we could do it. It was not, it was bit more complicated than this, because you had to redo the whole software thing, how to read the sensor, because usually you have the software reading the sensor with a Bayer pattern. Yeah. So we had to redo this, but we didn't know what should be done. And so the decision was, when at a certain time, that was 2010, when we looked in this, because we didn't know about this since 2005, because basically a sensor without Bayer pattern only sees a grayscale, black and white. In 2010, when we said it's possible, we said, if it's possible, let's try to do it. And I think I can mention this, there might be other monochromes somewhere down the road.
I imagine there would be. And what was the thinking behind the M10D? Because I love that camera.
The M10, which one? Sorry.
The D. The M10D, the one without the screen on the back.
I know.
And with the faux advance lever.
No. Actually, when we discussed this, I said this is crazy. We should not do this. Yeah, because you take the key thing away from digital because you see it immediately. But then we thought, it sounds interesting because it gives you a sort of analog feeling in digital, because at the end you don't know exactly what's the outcome. And I think that's an interesting way of shooting, because you learn more. Yeah. Although I must admit, I don't have one.
Well, speaking of other cameras, the Leica Q, how important has that been? We have someone from the audience asking, as a gateway into the M system. Does it serve that purpose?
No, it does not, because it's based on a different technology platform, although there are some elements in it. The Q, it's not so much known, was originally the opener for the SL system.
Huh.
Because what's in the Q was related to the SL, and it was a test case in a fixed lens, if this sort of setup would work. And originally, we only planned a few thousand pieces of the Q, because we were not sure about this, because we said we need a sort of later replacement for the R system, which was the SL. And this was the sort of starting point for this kind of technology, processor, etc. And so it was basically the starting point for the SL. But it became a product in itself.
It's gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. And it represents a fundamentally different entry price into the world of Leica. That 28 millimeter 1.7 is just fabulous. And you would pay that much for the lens alone in the M system. So yeah, I can imagine it's been very successful for you.
I would say, if we would be just together privately, I would say, it's still too cheap, because an M10 with a 28-2 has a totally different price point. So compared to this, it's a cheap entry point. And I know for a lot of customers, it's not cheap. I know that.
Well, no, it's not, but it is an extraordinary entry into the world of Leica and Leica heritage. The design cues from the M are clear. It's kind of, if you're a street shooter and 28 millimeter is your jam, and you don't zone focus, you don't like rangefinder, you've now got, especially in the Q2, an incredible OLED EVF, which is just fantastic. It's got the best autofocusing manual lens I've ever seen. And the Q2 with the 47 megapixels allows you to crop. And it's interesting, you talked about cropping earlier with Nick Utt. I understand the value of cropping, but do you have a particular philosophy about cropping?
Well, in the digital world, that's a way to do it, but only when we were there with sensors with a huge amount of megapixels. Because before that, it would have created a ridiculous result. So when you have, let's say, the 47, or maybe later on, or when you compare to the S3 64, when you crop there, it makes sense. It changes the sort of let's call it the optical experience, but the picture still looks good. So in digital, it makes a lot of sense. In analog, it was always about the composition. Yeah, because something was in the foreground which did not fit, or you change it a little bit and then cut it here. So this is still the case in digital, but it also creates a sort of optical effect that suddenly at 28 looks like 35.
You know, it's interesting. We need to wrap up, but I find myself thinking, as I said earlier, Peter Carby really just knocked my socks off. And so I have this specifically because with the 35 and 47 megapixels, I can crop the crap out of this. And but to be fair, I am stunned with how you can crop on the little CL with 24 millimeters, 24 megapixels as well. But I keep coming back to the M. And I keep coming back to the M because it is essential. And these lenses are so small. You can pack a 24, a 35, 50, and a 90 in a smaller bag than I actually own. Do you have a sense of who the what is the profile for an M shooter these days? Has it changed? Is it changing?
It is changing, and it depends on in which region of the world you're looking. So for instance, in Asia, it's a little bit different compared to Europe and compared to US. So in Asia, you see in the M system much younger people because it's considered to be as a very cool thing. And it looks different. Yeah. So there sometimes is a sort of, you differentiate yourself. So in Europe, especially in Germany, we have a little bit more of a traditional customership here. It's changing a bit too, but it started changing first in Asia, especially in Japan.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You know, like young students with a certain kind of outfit carrying an M, which probably in Europe you might not always see.
Well, I think we have to wrap up. I know you've got a big meeting tomorrow. Thank you so much, Andreas, for taking the time late on a Wednesday night to sit down with us. I am just gobsmacked. I am gobsmacked by the trajectory of the company since you came on board. It really seems to have retained the essence of what has made Leica so special in terms of its people and ethos as a company, and with the products. I mean, you're costing me a lot of money. That's all I'm going to say about that. So thank you very, very much. But let me give you the last word.
So Hugh, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who listened. And we all hope that we stay healthy and safe. And hopefully see us somewhere, sometime at events which might come again in when we then can create things like we did before. And hopefully this episode, which might be called COVID or whatever, will be later on just a page in the history books. So thank you all, and thank you especially Hugh Brownstone, and thank you also the Leica team USA. Great job, thanks.